Today, I'm talking about a book with not one, but two adaptations that were made 30 years apart. The Witches is another classic from Roald Dahl, and the 1990 adaptation starring Anjelica Huston is the one I grew up with and love. So how does the 2020 HBO adaptation compare? Keep watching and find out. Hey there, I'm Jessica, and this is Bookshelf to Big Screen. If you're new to the channel, I take a look at books that have been adapted to the big or small screen and tell you what changed. So if you only watch the movie and don't want to look like a fool at book club, be sure to subscribe. Okay, the story is about a boy who is raised by his grandmother after his parents die in a car accident. His grandmother knows all about witches and she teaches him how to identify and avoid them. The 90s adaptation stayed pretty true to the book, but the 2020 version gives us a more modern take and moves the story from Norway and England to the US, so there's quite a few cultural changes, but the main plot is there. In the book, the story starts with a warning about witches, how they can be any woman and you can't really tell. The narrator is our main character, the boy, but he's older now, telling the story of what had happened to him. His parents are Norwegian, like his grandmother, but he was born in England. On the way to visit his grandmother for Christmas, they are in a car accident and his parents are killed, but he survives. The old adaptation starts in Norway with the grandmother telling her grandson about witches. After a few stories, the boy's parents go out for the evening, and in the morning, the police come to tell them there was an accident. The new movie starts more similarly to the book. The grandson is grown, but we don't see him yet, and he's giving a class on witches and his experience with them. He lived in Chicago when his parents died in a car accident, and his grandma comes and takes him home with her to Alabama. In the book, after the accident, Grandma tells the boy about 5 children that were taken by the witches. The first simply vanished. The second appeared in the painting in her family's house where she grew old and would appear in different parts of the painting until she disappeared one day after 54 years. The third was a girl who turned into a chicken who laid big brown eggs and her parents kept her in a pen in the yard. The fourth was a boy who turned into stone and his parents kept him in the hall where visitors could lean their umbrellas against him. The fifth boy jumped into the sea, and when he came up, he was a porpoise. He stayed with his family for the day, giving his siblings rides, and then swam away and was never seen again. In the first movie, Grandma only tells the story about the girl in the painting, who was her best friend. But it happens the same way where she grows old in the painting until she finally disappears. Also, she tells this story before the parents' accident. In the new movie, we get the story about the girl who turned into a chicken. However, Grandma doesn't tell this story until after the boy first encounters a witch. Also, the girl's parents didn't know the chicken was their child, and the chicken laid big green eggs. In the book, Grandma finally tells the boy how he can recognize a witch. First, a witch will always wear gloves because she has thin curvy claws instead of fingernails. Second, witches are bald, so they wear wigs, but the wigs give them bad rashes. Also, witches have slightly larger nose holes, and they find children incredibly stinky. Next, instead of a black iris in their eyes, they have a dot that changes color constantly. Witches also have no toes, just feet with square ends, but they hide them by squeezing their feet into pointed shoes. Finally, Grandma says that a witch's spit is blue like ink and they could use it to write with. In the first movie, Grandma tells the boy how to spot a witch before the accident. She doesn't talk about the gloves, but when we see the witch from her story about the girl in the painting, we can see why she might cover her hands. She mentions the wigs and the shoes, but here she says that because they have no toes, they only wear sensible shoes and never pointy ones. The eyes of the witches in this movie have a purple tint, and She doesn't talk about the witches having larger nostrils, but she does say that they have a great sense of smell and that the kids stink to them. There's no mention of the blue spit. In the new movie, Grandma doesn't tell the boy about witches until after he tells her about a scary lady he saw at the grocery store. When he says the lady's mouth did something weird, Grandma asks if she was wearing long gloves and a hat, and if her voice was scratchy, and when he confirms, she tells him it was a witch. The mouth thing and the scratchy voice are new witch characteristics in this movie. In the book, they move to England so the boy can finish school there, per his parents' wishes. One day, the boy is up in his treehouse when he sees a woman standing at the bottom of the tree. He sees that she's wearing long gloves and she tries to give him a snake as a present. He climbs higher up the tree until he can't see the woman and stays there until Grandma comes out to get him. After this, she doesn't let him walk home alone. In the first movie, they do go to England like in the book, and the boy's first encounter is very similar. But the difference is that Grandma scares the witch away when she comes out looking for the boy, and she actually sees the witch. In the new movie, the boy sees the witch in the grocery store before he knows anything about witches. The witch tries to give him candy instead of a snake, but a snake does come out of her sleeve. The boy doesn't tell Grandma about the scary lady until later that night. In the book, they plan to spend the summer in Norway, but Grandma gets pneumonia and the doctor says they can't go. But after she recovers a bit, he says it's okay to go to the south coast of England. As a way to make up for the disappointment of not going to Norway, Grandma gives the boy 2 white mice, which he takes with them. Calls them William and Mary, and once they get to the hotel, he starts teaching them tricks. Their second day in the hotel, the maid sees the mice and reports them to the manager. After Grandma threatens to report the hotel to the health authority for rats, he agrees to let the mice stay, but they have to be kept inside their cage in the room. In the first movie, Grandma gives the boy the mice, which he also calls William and Mary, as a birthday present after the witch encounter. But she gets sick and is diagnosed with diabetes. The doctor puts her on a new diet and recommends a holiday by the sea. While the boy is out of his room, the maid sees the mice and hysterically tells the manager, and Grandma still threatens the manager until he agrees to let them stay. In the new movie, Grandma gives the boy only one mouse, and he calls her Daisy. There's some indication that Grandma is sick, and we don't know exactly what's wrong with her, but it's inferred that it has something to do with the witches. As soon as Grandma realizes it was a witch in the grocery store, she tells the boy they need to leave. This is also when the boy starts to think that his grandma might be a voodoo priestess. Grandma says she'll call her cousin, who was the head chef at a big hotel in Alabama, and he'll get them a room. She says they'll be safe there because only rich white people stay there, and witches only prey on the poor and overlooked. So instead of the old world witch lore from the book and the first movie, this movie has a cultural update for the new location in the South and the ethnicity of the main characters. We also now have this commentary on social classes and wealth inequity in the South at the time. For example, when they arrive at the hotel, the valet is surprised to see their guests of the hotel, and there's a slightly cringy exchange with the hotel manager where he says how lucky they are to be staying there. In the book, the boy goes into the ballroom to have a quiet place to train his mice. He hides behind a folding screen at the back of the room and works on teaching his mice tightrope walking. A group of about 200 ladies come in to have a meeting, so he has to stay hidden. He notices that the ladies are all scratching their necks and heads, and he realizes they're wearing wigs. Then he sees that they're all wearing gloves, so they must be witches. He has no way out, so he decides to wait quietly. He sees a young woman about 4.5 feet tall on the stage wearing a long black dress with long black gloves. The woman reaches behind her cheek and pulls off her face, which turns out to be a mask. Her real face is the most frightening thing he's ever seen, and he knows this must be the Grand High Witch. The first movie follows this story pretty closely, but the folding screen is at the front of the room next to the stage. The boy notices one lady's eyes first and realizes he needs to get out. The Grand High Witch is played by the incredible Anjelica Huston, who, in my opinion, is the best thing about this movie. She's simultaneously classy and terrifying. The Grand High Witch tells them they can all take off their shoes, then make sure the doors are locked, and finally removes her mask. One other thing I love about this adaptation is that Jim Henson was executive producer on the film, and I believe because of that, we have this incredible physical transformation into the Grand High Witch. There's no CGI back then. People had to physically make these special effects, and that's awesome. This terrified me as a child. It reminded me of another Jim Henson creation that I found equally terrifying. Anyone remember these guys? Thank you, Jim Henson, for haunting my nightmares. My point is, in the book, this is the most terrifying thing the boy has ever seen, and in my opinion, this adaptation nails it. In the new movie, there's no folding screen for the boy to hide behind. Instead, he hides under the platform. The witches remove their gloves and shoes before finally removing their wigs. The Grand High Witch does not wear a mask, but she does pull a worm out of her head and then eat it. Okay, so I have a lot of issues here. I really like Anne Hathaway in a lot of the roles she's had, but this is not one of them. In the book, the Grand High Witch is described as having an odd European accent, but Anne Hathaway's is terrible. Like, not even in a funny way, it's just bad. And instead of the masks, all the witches have this grossly large CGI mouth, which I don't think would have been so bad if they didn't have these hugely visible scars on their face. The whole point of the book is that it's very difficult to tell who's really a witch because they blend in so well. You can't really do that with massive Joker-style face scars. Also, there was this huge controversy when the trailer came out because it showed the decision to change the claw-like nails into appendages with only 3 fingers. The problem with this decision is that this limb difference is a real condition called ectrodactyly. So naturally, people were mad. This is a movie for kids, so saying that people that look like this are mean or scary is pretty shitty. On top of this, the Grand High Witch has a single middle toe, which is another decision that I just don't understand. In the book, the Grand High Witch says that she wants the witches to destroy all the children, and when another witch argues with her, the Grand High Witch shoots sparks out of her eyes and obliterates the witch. In the first movie, the witch doesn't speak out directly against the Grand High Witch. She quietly says her comment to the witch next to her, but the Grand High Witch hears her and gets mad. She also shoots beams from her eyes to take the witch out, so it's very similar to the book. In the new movie, the witch stands up to ask if the Grand High Witch has a plan for wiping out all the children, and the Grand High Witch zaps her and then says that was actually a good question. In the book and first adaptation, the witch is seen as being argumentative with the Grand High Witch, which is not really the case here. Also, in this adaptation, the Grand High Witch can now fly. In the book, the Grand High Witch announces her plan. She wants them to go back to their towns, resign from their jobs, and buy sweet shops. Then they'll announce a grand opening where they'll be giving free sweets to every child. But all the candy will be filled with the Grand High Witch's greatest magical formula, a green liquid called Formula 86, Delayed Action Mouse Maker. She says it starts working at 9 a.m. the next morning when the children will be arriving at school, and after 26 seconds, they are changed into mice, and then the teachers will be left to deal with them. The Grand High Witch also gives very detailed instructions on how to make Formula 86, which includes some odd ingredients and an alarm clock, which is how they can set the delayed response. In the first movie, the Grand High Witch shows them some of the money that they'll use to buy the sweet shops. The delay on Formula 86 is set to 2 hours, but more than 5 doses will make the formula work instantly, and the change happens in only 25 seconds. In the new movie, the plan to buy sweet shops and use Formula 86 is the same, but the liquid is purple. In the book, the boys' mice run out into the ballroom and the witches think they are children. The Grand High Witch has already turned. The Grand High Witch realizes they are pet mice and kicks them off the stage, and she says she will take care of the boy who owns them herself. Then she says she's going to give a demonstration of Formula 86. She says she made a special batch that was set for 3:30 and put it in a chocolate bar that she gave to a boy in the lobby. She told him to go to the ballroom at 3:25 if he wanted more. Bruno Jenkins knocks on the door and all the witches put their disguises back on and let him in. This is the first time we're introduced to the character, and the boy gives a little background on Bruno, saying that he doesn't really like him because he's the kind of kid who's always bragging about how much his father makes, and he's always eating something. Once Bruno is in the room, the Grand High Witch starts counting down. When she gets to 1, Bruno starts shrinking and turns into a brown mouse and runs away. In the first movie, the boy meets Bruno earlier when he's wandering around the hotel. While the Grand High Witch is giving her presentation, the boys' mice do escape, but the witches don't see them. After the countdown, the transformation begins. I want to talk quickly about these special effects. I know that if you watch this now, you might think it's cheesy, but as a kid in 1990, this scene reminded me of this scene from the 1983 Twilight Zone movie, and that shit scared me. So I feel like it was pretty effective. The way the camera moves around and disorients you a bit also helps. At the end of it, Bruno is a little brown mouse and he runs away. In the new movie, after Bruno turns into a mouse, he starts talking, asking for his chocolate, and the witches try to squish him. When the boy expresses his concern for Bruno, Daisy talks too, saying she'll go and get him. In the book, just as the meeting is ending, one of the witches in the back row calls out to everyone that she smells dog droppings, which is what children smell like to the witches. They quickly find the boy and he tries to escape, but the doors are chained and there's no other way out. They catch him and take him to the platform where they pour a whole bottle of Formula 86 down his throat. Once he's a mouse, he takes off before the witches can kill him with a mousetrap. When the witches are all gone, he finds Bruno, who hadn't yet realized he's a mouse, and together they go to find Grandma. In the first movie, like the book, one witch catches a whiff of the boy just as everyone's leaving. The boy makes a run for it and he escapes through a back door, then breaks a window and runs out onto the beach. He makes a quick stop to save a baby and then heads to Grandma's room, but she won't wake up and the witches get him anyway. They give him the formula, he turns into a mouse, and they try to squish him, but he gets away. He realizes that he can talk and calls out for Bruno. After telling Bruno he's a mouse, they run into William and Mary, who cannot talk, and then head to Grandma's room. In the new movie, Daisy drags Bruno back to the boy, and he tells Bruno a witch turned him into a mouse. This one is really different from the book because since the boy was hiding under the stage, the Grand High Witch has been catching his scent from the very beginning. She even tossed the stage at one point, but he managed to sneak into a vent before she could catch him. But now that Bruno is with him, the Grand High Witch finds him and pulls him out of his hiding spot. When he won't open his mouth, she pours the formula into his ear. The Grand High Witch catches him by the tail, but Daisy runs out and bites her finger. They run into the vent, but the Grand High Witch has witchy go-go gadget style arms that follow them. Just before she grabs them, they fall through the bottom of the vent and the witch's hands get sliced up in the fan. I think it's interesting here that her blood is kind of inky, which I think is a nod to the inky spit in the book. In the book, on the way to Grandma's room, they hide in some shoes to avoid the maid and manager. But the maid picks up the shoes and the boy instinctively bites her. She cries out and runs away, causing Grandma to open the door to see what's going on. They run in and tell Grandma to hurry and close the door. Grandma starts crying and they explain what happened. They realize that their room is directly above the Grand High Witch's room and make a plan to get a bottle of Formula 86 to use against the witches. In the first movie, they hide on the cleaning cart and bite the maid when she reaches for the towels. Grandma opens the door and they run in, but she sees that one of the maids is a witch. The part where the boy feels Grandma in and they come up with a plan is pretty much the same. In the new movie, once they're away from the witches, Daisy reveals that she used to be a little girl and was also turned into a mouse by a witch. The three mice work together to ring the doorbell to Grandma's room, but the maid sees them and chases them with a broom. When Grandma opens the door, the maid pushes her back into the room and pulls the door shut. When Grandma hears the story, she asks why Daisy didn't tell them earlier. And Daisy said it's dangerous for a mouse to talk, but she almost told them when Grandma was telling her a story about the girl who was turned into a chicken. They're interrupted by a janitor who comes to lay some mouse traps. They have the plan to get the formula, but Grandma thinks that she can reverse engineer it and use it to create a potion that will turn them back into kids. In the book, Grandma puts the boy into one of her half-finished knitted socks and lowers him down into the Grand High Witch's balcony. The boy finds a bottle of the formula inside the mattress, but before he can leave, the Grand High Witch comes in. He hides under the bed and sees 3 frogs that he believes must have been children too. The Grand High Witch peeks under the bed, telling the frogs that she's going to throw them out to the seagulls at night, but she doesn't see the boy. Grandma calls out, telling him to hurry, but the Grand High Witch answers her instead. Grandma says she dropped her knitting and was just talking to her grandson who was in the bathroom. Just then, the other witches arrive to pick up their supplies from the Grand High Witch, and the boy makes a run for it through the open door without being seen. In the first movie, Grandma lowers him down with the knitting, but there's a cat in the room. Grandma distracts the cat with her yarn and the boy finds the formula hidden in a book on a shelf. Grandma tells the Grand High Witch that she dropped the sock and asks if she's seen her grandson. The boy still makes his escape when the other witches show up. In the new movie, Grandma and the boy see that the Grand High Witch is keeping the formula on ice. Grandma lowers the boy in the sock and he grabs a bottle of the formula. When the Grand High Witch comes back, the boy runs back into the sock to escape, but she catches it before Grandma can pull it up. The Grand High Witch says that she knows Grandma, but before she can remember where from, the manager knocks on the door and Grandma is able to pull the boy to safety. In the book, Grandma tries to tell Bruno's parents about what happened, but they don't believe her and just think that she's crazy. Grandma pulls Bruno out to show them, but Mrs. Jenkins starts screaming, so she just leaves. The boy plans to go into the kitchen and dose the witch's food with the formula. He overhears a waiter say the witches are having the soup and he pours the whole bottle into the pot. But he makes some noise when he's leaving and everyone in the kitchen tries to catch him. He gets the tip of his tail cut off and runs up a cook's pants, runs out the other side, and hides in a sack of potatoes until he can get back to Grandma. In the first movie, telling Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins that Bruno was turned into a mouse by the witches goes about as well as in the book, except Bruno tries to talk to them before Grandma leaves. In the kitchen, the boy almost falls into the pot, but he gets the formula into the soup. Like in the book, the boy is seen when he tries to leave and gets the tip of his tail chopped off. He runs up the cook's leg and makes his escape. In the new movie, we have the added scene of Grandma trying to make the new potion to turn them back into kids, but it doesn't work. So they plan instead to put the formula in the witch's food. The boy heads to the kitchen and gets the formula into the soup. A cook sees him and says to call for an exterminator, but there's no close calls in the kitchen. Grandma goes to see Bruno's parents, and it goes about the same, but Bruno doesn't speak because he's too busy eating. In the book, Mr. Jenkins confronts Grandma at dinner, asking her where Bruno is. He still doesn't believe her until Bruno pops out of her handbag and finally speaks up. Mr. Jenkins is shocked, but finally believes what happened. And Grandma points out the Grand High Witch, telling Mr. Jenkins that she's the one responsible. Mr. Jenkins declares he'll send his lawyers after her and starts making his way over to her, but that's when the witches start turning into mice. The staff start attacking the mice, Grandma returns Bruno to Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, and she and the boy take a taxi and leave. They go back to Norway, and Grandma rigs the house to be mouse-friendly. In the end, Grandma tracks down the Grand High Witch's address, and they make a plan to take out the rest of the witches. They'll go to the witch headquarters, make more Formula 86, and turn all the witches into mice, and then release cats into the building. After they're gone, they'll go and get the addresses for all the witches in the world and keep taking them out for the rest of their lives. In the first movie, Mr. Jenkins makes a fuss and demands to have the same soup as the witches, so Grandma has to rush over and stop him from eating it. Bruno finally gets his parents' attention, and they seem to come around. All the witches start turning into mice, and the Grand High Witch turns into a disgusting-looking rodent. Grandma traps her and calls the manager to deal with her. Before they leave the hotel, the boy puts his address on the Grand High Witch's luggage, so the big trunk full of money is delivered to their home. The trunk also included the Grand High Witch's address book, so they planned to go to America and take out the witches there. In the end, there was one witch that wasn't turned into a mouse. She was the Grand High Witch's secretary, and the Grand High Witch refused to let her go to the dinner because she was only there to work. So she was kind of grateful to the boy and turns him back into a boy. She even returns his pet mice, and he reminds her not to forget about Bruno, so we can assume that he'll be turned back too. In the new movie, the Grand High Witch catches sight of Grandma, so she never actually eats the soup. The Grand High Witch finally remembers Grandma and confronts her. While she does, the boy is able to grab her room key, and then the witches all start turning into mice. They sneak into the Grand High Witch's room to take all of the Formula 86, but the Grand High Witch catches them. The kids work together and they're able to get the Grand High Witch to drink the formula. Once she's turned, Grandma traps her and they find the witch's money and address book. They load it all up and leave, but not before releasing the witch's cat. When Bruno tries to talk to his mom, she freaks out, so Bruno goes to live with the boy, Daisy, and Grandma. In the end, they travel the world and keep turning witches into mice. We see the boy, now an old mouse, training a group of children on how to use the formula to turn witches into mice. Okay, I've already said I love the 90s version, but there are a couple of things I liked about the new adaptation. First of all, you've got Octavia Spencer as Grandma, but also Kristen Chenoweth as Daisy and Chris Rock as the older boy mouse. That's pretty cool. Second, even though there are many changes, they kept a lot of the original dialogue from the book, and I liked how the beginning and end were a little more in line with the book. Having said that, as a whole, I don't really like this new adaptation. I just can't get over how terrible Anne Hathaway is as the Grand High Witch, and it really just ruined it for me. I'm okay with pretty much every other aspect of the movie, minus the change to the witch's physical appearance. but the Grand High Witch is supposed to be the most terrifying thing ever, and that just didn't come across. The CGI mouth and teeth are creepy, but I just don't think it compares to Jim Henson style special effects, and Anjelica Huston is a damn queen. So there you have it. That's my recap on The Witches by Roald Dahl and the 1990 and 2020 movie adaptations. I've included links to the book and movies in the description below so you can check them out for yourselves. If you enjoyed this review, please click like and be sure to click subscribe to see my next video. Thanks for watching.